Sometimes, when things are fractured or broken, or our world seems a little less whole, or feels like our back is up against the wall, we have to get creative with practicing shalom. There were once these 4 individuals who were hoping for something amazing. Not for themselves, but for their friend who was paralyzed. They had heard about this teacher, a rabbi from Nazareth named Jesus, who had the power to heal people. And they had hoped that they might be able to do something for their friend. So they put him on a mat and they carried him to a house where they heard this miracle worker had set up shop. And when they got to the place, their hearts sank because the building was slammed full. This massive crowd had gathered around Jesus, filling every nook and cranny of the room and then spilling out around the house. And you can imagine people just peering through the windows, trying to get a glimpse of this teaching and what Jesus was doing in that moment. So there was seemingly no way for them to get their friend to Jesus. What now? I kind of wonder about the conversation that transpired at this moment. Did these friends consider waiting until the crowd thinned out? Was one of them ready to pack it up and go home? They're like, "Nah, man, we tried." I can imagine the type A friend arguing about how they should have gotten to the house earlier. Amen? And that all those type A people in here are like, yeah, for real. All that we do know is that the friends had a sense of urgency around them. They didn't know if they were going to have another chance to connect to Jesus. They knew Jesus was traveling from town to town, and he may not pass by their way again, so their backs were against the wall. If they really wanted their friend to have this encounter with the miracle worker, this might be their only shot. So eventually, somebody in this group decided that if they were going to get inside, they were going to have to get creative. Now, I wonder which of the men came up with the idea of breaking through the roof. I can imagine him thinking it and realizing like it's not a thought you say out loud. And being like, no, that's crazy. We shouldn't really do that, should we? But then had the courage in that moment to say, hey, how about we break through the roof? If anyone is in here right now and has an idea that God has given you about how we can better serve our community, that we can better help love and support those in our neighborhoods, please don't keep it to yourself. Speak up. You never know when an idea that God has placed within you is the exact right good idea to help people know that they're loved and healed and worthy. The idea was going to cause a bit of disruption. But this was their friend, and he was worth the risk. See, I think this is true about the work of shalom. Sometimes doing shalomic work, which isn't a word, I'm making it up, I'm going to use it all day. Sometimes doing shalomic work in our world requires us to be disruptive. William Ury, I was listening to a podcast by him this week, and if you don't know him, he is a leader in our world who has helped navigate ceasefires in multiple war zones, including an end to some really risky behaviors in North Korea and around our globe. He says in the podcast that part of what he's learned over the last 30 years of helping prevent wars and engage people to come out of war is that you have to be able to find a third way. That the people who are in conflict together and there's mess in their life, all they can think about is what they want. And they can't often wrap their head around that there might be something else possible. And he said often this third way comes about by disruptive thinking that leads us, both parties, to begin to realize that there's something more that might be possible. Now imagine that you are on the inside of that house. Luke tells us that Jesus was surrounded by the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. These are the religious leaders at the time. And these leaders saw their work as maintaining religious order, right? Keeping things under control and even articulating what is God's will for our people and for us. And so they're sitting there listening to Jesus, and Jesus is teaching. We don't know what he's saying because Luke doesn't tell us. But at some point, the people in the crowd had to start hearing some noises. You can imagine them being like, "Did you hear that? What is that?" And the shuffling and the murmurs grew louder and more consistent until there was a definite ruckus on the roof. And whoever was causing this commotion, it sounded like they were tearing it apart. And you can imagine suddenly that this kind of beam of light comes through from the broken ceiling, and everyone stood up in shock. And you can kind of imagine these like 4 little faces leaning in. And then they begin to lower their friend down into the house on this mat until he was placed at the feet of Jesus. Now, Luke doesn't record what the crowd's response was to this brazen act. But you gotta think that there was a little bit of consternation concerning this hole in the ceiling. You can hear the murmurs of, "Who do they think they are? The nerve to tear a hole in someone else's roof? This isn't proper. This isn't civilized. These rabble-rousers are causing a scene. How dare they? Who's going to fix that roof?" Right? You can hear that one too. Couldn't they have gone through the proper channels to see Jesus? Perhaps, couldn't they have made an appointment to talk to Jesus later? And you can imagine that there were a few people in that room who didn't like what they saw. But what Jesus saw was faith. Now, often I think when we think about faith, we think about faith as a confession of belief. Like, this is an altar rail. Confession, it's an altar rail. But here, it's a far deeper understanding than that. Oh, I believe in Jesus. Robert Tannehill puts it this way. He says, this faith is trusting that God can help through Jesus and doing all that is necessary to secure that help. It's the opposite of passivity. It shows itself as courageous action. Might I add, shalomic action. Movement toward wholeness. It was a faith that was willing to do the work. It was a faith that got creative to get their hands dirty because there was a possibility of a life-changing encounter with God on the other side. This is the work of creating shalom. I also wonder if Jesus saw a little bit about what he was about in the courageous actions of these friends. After all, what is incarnation? It's this idea that God humbly comes to earth in the guise of a human being other than heaven, tearing a hole into earth's roof. God lowering God's self down into a mass of humanity in the form of a poor, vulnerable person. It was a gambit. Right, but it was a gambit worth taking because it meant that creation could have this beautiful encounter between God and us. And this wasn't the only roof that Jesus tore into. His ministry was full of tearing into roofs. In what he did, in who he loved, and how he showed us what God is like. This tearing up the roof life of Jesus still resonates today to the point that we meet here every Sunday and we talk about and hopefully orient our lives being tearing the roof kind of open people. Of course, the deeds of these four friends and of Jesus were courageous acts driven by love. These four friends loved their friends so much that they were willing to risk whatever consequences would come from tearing into somebody else's house. See, love makes a scene. The work of Shalom will sometimes make a scene. Sure, it has quieter moments as well, but love compels people to make lavish proposals, right? It propels people to stay up all night putting together stupid toys for our children at Christmas. It propels people to drive across the country to be with a friend or to spill into the streets in order to help a neighbor who's hurting. Faith driven by love compels us to courageous shalomic action in our world. And Jesus, he sees that action, that courageous action, and said something that no one in the crowd expected. He says, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." Now, that's not what the four friends who tore open the roof came for. It certainly wasn't something that the religious leaders thought that Jesus should do or proclaim. It's strange. Jesus offers spiritual healing to a man who is quite obviously there to be physically healed. I can almost hear the friends on the roof saying like, "Come on, man, read the room. Heal the guy. What are we doing here?" Jesus seemed to understand that there were things that the room didn't understand. Throughout his ministry, Jesus seeks to minister to all aspects of an individual. He heals the sick. He helps the paralyzed dance. He restores the dignity to those who have been ostracized by their communities. He offers forgiveness to those whose journeys have taken them into dark places. Fred Craddock notes that we often think of a person as composed of body, mind, feeling, and soul. And perhaps thinking in terms like those divisions keep us from understanding that Jesus' ministry was a ministry of shalom, restoring a whole person. Shalom doesn't just fix our body. Shalom fixes everything. And Jesus understood in this moment that a person who could walk but was still weighed down by sin, those ways in which we miss the mark, could not truly move forward in the way that Jesus hoped for him. And Jesus understood that a person who could walk could still be weighed down. In fact, Jesus seemed to understand that the barrier to this man's wholeness, to his misalignment of his soul, was that, a misalignment of the soul, not just a perceived disability. After all, Irenaeus said that the glory of God is man fully alive, and one can be fully alive and be sick and in a wheelchair. But it's hard to be fully alive, carrying guilt and regret wherever you go. It's hard to be fully alive when your relationships with God and yourself and others are broken. So in the midst of this conversation over whether this rabbi from Nazareth really had authority to forgive sins, Jesus says, "Just so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, get up, take your mat, and go home." And this is just what the man did. He stood up for the first time in who knows how long. The crowd who wouldn't let him in the door now splits like the Red Sea so that he can walk out. And this man glorified God the entire way home because he was healed, soul and body. Everybody on the roof and in the room, even the religious leaders, had this debate with Jesus, but now they were swept up in the awe of the miracle. And in that moment, we're all caught up in the electricity of what happens when a person comes fully alive. And they glorified God. So as I conclude this morning, let us ask ourselves, where are people proclaiming good news to the poor? Relief from fear and debt and worry? Where are people struggling to release those imprisoned by evil governments, by tyrannical families, or oppressive social systems, or by criminal gangs, or by loneliness, or by poverty? Where are people working for new ways to free people from physical blindness and disease and malnutrition and pain and mental illness? Where are people being freed from spiritual bondage, from emotional blindness, being freed to see themselves with dignity and self-respect? Where are the oppressed of every kind having their heavy burdens lift off their shoulders by generous and imaginative action, and brought to realize that they are loved and valued and forgiven children of God, with rich potential that God sees in all of us and delights in? These are where God's shalom is breaking through the building's roof and bringing kingdom of heaven on earth. And if Jesus is truly present in a place, we will still see these things happening today. Maybe in small, quiet ways. Maybe in large, unmistakable ways. But it will always be there. Again and again, Jesus heals those who come to him. But this man could not come to Jesus by his own power. He was paralyzed. Instead, we have this wonderful news of 4 friends who brought this man to Jesus. 4 friends who were radically invested in their friend, so much so that they would do anything they could do in order for him to have full and abundant life. This is the shalomic work, the shalomic imagination that we are all being called into at every moment as followers of the way of Jesus, that we too would climb on whatever proverbial roofs we have to and tear back the shingles so that one person might have the opportunity to connect with the redeeming love of Christ. This is our call. Being fully alive doesn't happen by accident. Like it did for these 4 friends, it requires deep intentionality. It requires creativity. It lets us hold their bold example in our minds, because when we find ourselves tearing through the ceilings for God and for one another, pretty miraculous things can happen. May it be so.